Let's be clear, Africa isn't rising, it's re-rising, not because it fell, but because the world has finally begun to open its eyes. And ladies and gentlemen, in this re-rise, each one of you is both torch bearer and architect of Africa's new dawn. Once upon a time, the world coined the phrase, Africa Rising. It became a headline, a slogan, a neatly packaged narrative that made for good speeches in global conferences and glossy magazines. It was convenient for the world to believe Africa was finally stepping into the light, finally ready to be taken seriously. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Africa has always been rising. We didn't suddenly discover ambition. We didn't suddenly grow a backbone. What changed was not Africa. It was the world's perception of Africa. And the real story, the story that is unfolding now, is not Africa rising. It is Africa re-rising, because let's be honest. A people who were robbed of their resources, divided by artificial borders, told they were not enough, told they were behind, told they were dependent. Such a people do not start rising one day, they re-rise. They reclaim, they step back onto a stage that was always theirs. Re-rise means you've stood before, you've built before, you've led before. The empires of Mali, Songhai, Nubia, Ethiopia, Egypt. Do you think those were accidents? Do you think greatness is foreign to Africa? Absolutely not. What was interrupted is not our potential, but our narrative. What was stolen was not our ability, but our agency. And now, this generation has chosen not to wait for permission. Re-rising is different. Rising is passive. It suggests others noticed your progress and labeled it. Re-rising is intentional. It is aggressive. It is the sound of a lion that was caged and finally shakes the bars loose. Re-rising is when you stop asking to be included in someone else's story and begin writing your own. That is where Africa is now. That is why the conversation must shift. Look around. The fastest growing tech hubs are not in Silicon Valley. They are in Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, Kigali. The most dynamic new entrepreneurs are not asking to copy global models. They are designing models that suit their realities. Young Africans are not trying to escape Africa. They are building Africa. They are investing in Africa. They are turning frustrations into innovations, constraints into creativity. This is what re-rise looks like. A continent no longer defined by its wounds, but by its wisdom. No longer defined by what was taken, but by what is being created. But let's not pretend it is easy. Re-rising requires discipline. It demands that we dismantle mental slavery as much as economic systems. Too many of us are still prisoners of the idea that greatness must be validated by the West. Too many still wait for aid, for handouts, for someone else's approval. That mindset is the final chain to break. Re-rising is as much about mindset as it is about markets. It is about believing that African solutions are not second-class answers but world-class innovations. Unity is the fuel of re-rising. For too long, we have allowed borders drawn in Berlin to dictate how we collaborate. Yet the future of Africa does not lie in fragmented markets of 50+ nations. It lies in a single, powerful, interconnected Africa. When we think together, trade together, build together, we stop being small players begging for a seat and start being a global force that designs the table. Re-rising means Pan-Africanism is not a slogan for speeches. It is a strategy for survival and prosperity. And yes, the world is watching, but this time we are not rising to impress them. We are not re-rising for their applause. We are re-rising because destiny demands it. We are re-rising because our children deserve it. We are re-rising because a continent of 4 billion people with the youngest population on Earth cannot remain in the shadows. That energy, that youth, that hunger, they are not statistics. They are fuel. They are the pulse of a new Africa. The truth is, Africa doesn't need saviors. It needs partners. It doesn't need sympathy. It needs strategy. It doesn't need charity. It needs capital, collaboration, courage. And those who see Africa through the old lens will miss it. Those who think Africa is still the continent of waiting and wanting will be shocked when they realize Africa is leading, creating, shaping. So the message is simple. Stop calling it Africa Rising. That was yesterday's slogan. The moment has shifted. Africa is re-rising, and the re-rise cannot be stopped because it is not built on external validation. It is built on internal conviction. One day, when history books are written about this era, they will not say this was the decade the world discovered Africa. They will say this was the decade Africa rediscovered itself. This was the decade we stopped asking, when will Africa's time come? And we started declaring, the time is now. Re-rise is not a whisper, it is a roar. It is not a polite request for recognition. It is a demand for respect, and those who stand in its way will not silence it. So let me leave you with this. Rising is about being noticed. Re-rising is about being felt. And Africa's re-rise. You will feel it in your markets, in your politics, in your culture, in your boardrooms, in your streets. Because Africa is not waiting to rise. Africa is already re-rising. Innovation is not born in comfort. Innovation does not come from abundance. Innovation is not the privilege of those with excess. True innovation is born in necessity, in constraint, in challenge. And if that is the measure, then Africa is the greatest laboratory of innovation on earth. We have learned to make something from nothing, to build in spaces where resources are scarce, to find light in places of darkness. That is not just survival, that is innovation at its purest. For too long, the world has misunderstood Africa's ingenuity. They thought it was improvisation, a temporary solution to a problem that deserved a real solution from somewhere else. They dismissed it as informal, makeshift, inferior. But today the world is waking up to a truth we have always known. African innovation is not a footnote to global progress. It is a force shaping the very future of the world. Think of mobile money. Long before Western banks spoke of financial inclusion, before Silicon Valley discovered fintech, Africa had already revolutionized payments. M-Pesa in Kenya did not just give people a way to send money. It gave millions a way to live, to trade, to participate in an economy that had previously excluded them. That was not charity. That was African genius, solving African problems in a way so powerful that now the world borrows the model. Look at our renewable energy solutions. In communities where national grids fail, entrepreneurs have built solar home systems, micro-grids, and pay-as-you-go models that combine technology with financial creativity. They did not wait for governments. They did not wait for international funding. They created models so efficient and scalable that today global investors study them as benchmarks. Once again, necessity gave birth to invention, and Africa exported the lesson. But let's be clear. African innovation is not just about fixing local problems, it is about designing global futures. Artificial intelligence is not the monopoly of California. Biotechnology is not the playground of Europe. Creative industries are not owned by Hollywood. In every single one of these spaces, African innovators are not waiting at the back of the line. They are at the front, redefining the game. Nollywood is the second largest film industry in the world. Afrobeats dominates global charts. African tech startups are attracting billions in investment year after year because the world can no longer deny that brilliance lives here. What is powerful about African innovation is its authenticity. It is rooted in context. It is not about creating for vanity. It is about creating for survival, for scale, for real people. That is why it is sticky. That is why it works. Because when you innovate to solve a real problem faced by millions, your solution is not just viable, it is unstoppable. And when that solution works in Africa, it works anywhere. Because if you can make it work in the toughest conditions, you can make it work in the easiest ones. The challenge, however, is mindset. Too often, we, Africans, believe the lie that our ideas must be validated elsewhere to be valuable. We wait for international conferences to applaud us, for global investors to notice us, for Western media to write about us. That is dependency disguised as recognition. The truth is, our innovation is already world-class. We do not need applause, we need ownership. We do not need validation, we need vision. For Africa's innovation to shape the globe, we must do three things. First, we must scale. A brilliant idea in one village is powerful. But when it scales across borders, across nations, across the continent, it becomes unstoppable. Scale requires courage. It requires us to stop thinking in terms of national pride and start thinking in terms of continental impact. Second, we must invest in our own. Too often the brightest ideas are bought cheaply, exported, and scaled elsewhere. Then we import back our own genius at 10 times the price. That cycle must end. Capital must meet creativity at home. Africa must learn not just to invent, but to invest, not just to create, but to own. Third, we must tell our own stories. Innovation is as much about narrative as it is about invention. The world believes Silicon Valley leads because Silicon Valley tells its story. The world believes China builds because China tells its story. Africa must tell the story of its innovators, loudly and unapologetically, because the story you tell is the future you sell. So let the world know, African innovation is not emerging, it has emerged. It is not following, it is leading. It is not waiting. It is rewriting the script of global progress, and anyone who ignores it does so at their own peril. The future of healthcare will not be decided only in Geneva. It will be shaped in Lagos clinics using AI to diagnose disease. The future of fintech will not only be written in New York. It will be written in Nairobi and Johannesburg, where cashless societies are already reality. The future of storytelling will not be limited to Hollywood. It will be painted in Accra, sung in Lagos, filmed in Cape Town. This is the truth the world is waking up to. The solutions of tomorrow are already being built in Africa today. So here is the final message. Innovation is not about invention. It is about impact. And Africa's innovation has always been about impact. It has always been about people. It has always been about progress. That is why it matters. That is why it lasts. That is why it will lead the world, because Africa does not innovate to impress. Africa innovates to survive, to thrive, to create. And when survival turns into creation, creation turns into global impact. That is the power of African innovation. That is the legacy of Africa's rise. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the future the world cannot ignore. The greatest prisons are not built with bricks. They are built with beliefs. They are not guarded by soldiers. They are guarded by fears. Long before chains were wrapped around our bodies, chains were wrapped around our minds. And if we are to step into the future with courage, the first battle we must win is not in the economy, not in politics, not in infrastructure. The first battle is economic, because the hardest barriers are not economic. They are mental. We are told again and again that Africa is poor, that Africa is behind, that Africa is dependent, that Africa is late. And after hearing this story for generations, too many of us have stopped. We speak of ourselves as less, we wait for others to lead, we look outward for validation, we measure our progress by somebody else's yardstick. That is the first mental barrier we must break, the belief that our value comes from outside. Think about it. The natural resources that built global empires were dug from African soil. The labor that powered the industrial revolutions was stolen from African bodies. The creativity that inspires music, art, and culture around the world pulses from African hearts. Yet the narrative says we are consumers, not creators. That narrative is not only false, it is dangerous. Because when you believe you are less, you act as if you are less. And when you act as if you are less, the world treats you as less. The most destructive chains are invisible. A farmer who believes he is only a farmer will never see himself as a business owner. A young graduate who believes opportunity only exists abroad will never see possibility at home. An entrepreneur who believes their product must be validated in Europe before it matters will never scale with confidence in Africa. That is what mental slavery looks like. It is not in shackles, it is in self-perception. We must unlearn this. We must confront the quiet voice that whispers, "You can't." Because the truth is we can. The evidence is everywhere. Young Africans are building billion-dollar companies from scratch. They are inventing technologies that solve problems the West has not even begun to think about. They are creating music, film, and art that dominate global culture. They are not waiting for permission. They are not asking for applause. They are breaking the barriers of belief. And yet, the danger is always that the old voices creep back in, that fear of failure, that idea that success must look like someone else's success, that illusion that greatness belongs to others. But let me tell you something, failure is not fatal, fear is not fact, and greatness is not important. It is inherent. Economic barriers are real. but they can be overcome with resources, with policy, with infrastructure. Mental barriers are trickier because they are self-imposed, and the toughest thing to change is the way a person thinks about themselves. When you shift the mindset, you shift the destiny. When you believe differently, you build differently. Imagine for a moment if Africa's young population stopped seeing borders as barriers and started seeing them as opportunities. Imagine if instead of competing to escape, we competed to create. Imagine if instead of waiting for foreign capital, we mobilized African capital with African confidence. The transformation would be unstoppable. The rise of Africa is not just about what we build outside. It is about what we build inside. The world has already proven to us that it will not hand over dignity. Dignity is seized, it is owned, it is lived, and dignity begins with how we see ourselves. That is why breaking mental barriers is not optional. It is urgent. Because until we believe in ourselves, every plan, every policy, every strategy will be half executed. Let me give you an example. Think of the child in a rural school with no electricity, no internet, no modern tools. The world would say this child is disadvantaged. But if that child believes that limitation defines them, they will remain stuck. If that child believes their brilliance is not bound by circumstance, they will find a way to shine. That is why mindset matters more than resources. Because resources without belief build dependency. Belief, even without resources, builds resilience. We must also confront another mental barrier, the myth of scarcity. We have been told there is not enough capital, not enough jobs, not enough opportunity. And because we believe it, we fight each other for scraps. But the truth is, Africa is abundant. Abundant in people, in creativity, in energy, in culture, in possibility. The problem is not scarcity, it is vision. We must see abundance before we can create it. And finally, we must kill the barrier of comparison. Too many of us measure ourselves against Europe, against America, against Asia. We want to look like them, build like them, succeed like them. But Africa was not born to be a copy. Africa was born to be original. Our solutions must reflect our realities. Our greatness must wear our own colors. The moment we stop imitating and start innovating, the world will not just respect us, it will follow us. So let this be clear. The real rise of Africa will not come when GDP grows, or when roads are built, or when skyscrapers rise. The real rise will come when we think differently about who we are. When the young girl in Accra sees herself as a global leader, not a follower. When the entrepreneur in Nairobi sees themselves as a creator of value, not a seeker of approval. When the farmer in Limpopo sees himself as a businessman feeding the world, not a laborer struggling to survive. That is when the shift happens, because when the mind is free, the body follows. When the mind is strong, the economy follows. When the mind is courageous, the continent follows. And until we break the mental barriers, the economic ones will remain. But once we break them, once we tear down the walls in our heads, the world will see a new Africa, not rising timidly, re-rising boldly. The battle is not just outside, the battle is inside. Win that battle, and everything else becomes possible. The most dangerous lie ever told about Africa is that we are separate, that we are tribes divided by borders, languages, histories, and flags, that we are too fragmented to be united. But let us remember this truth. Those borders were not drawn by us. They were drawn by colonizers with rulers and names, slicing through communities, families, and nations as if they were carving a map for their own convenience. And for too long, we have accepted those borders as real barriers, as immovable walls. But they are not. They are lines on a piece of paper. The future demands that we think beyond them. Collaboration is not a luxury. Collaboration is not a nice to have. Collaboration is survival. Collaboration is the only way Africa moves from being a collection of small, fragile economies to a continental force that can sit at the global table with weight. Because individually, we are vulnerable. Together, we are unstoppable. Look at the numbers: 54 nations, 4 billion people, a collective GDP of more than $3 trillion. Alone, each market looks small compared to giants like China or the United States. But together, Africa is not small. Africa is the largest single resource of youth, of energy, of ideas, of ambition in the world today. That is why Pan-African collaboration is not a dream, it is a catalyst. The African Continental Free Trade Area is not just a policy. It is a revolution. It is the opportunity to create the largest free trade area in the world, connecting billions in commerce, movement, and possibility. But trade agreements mean nothing if the mindset does not shift. Collaboration must move from paper to practice. We must stop competing as fragments and start creating as one. Because the rest of the world is already moving as blocks. Europe, Asia, North America. The only way we can compete globally is to unite continentally. Think of what collaboration could do for innovation. A startup in Nairobi should not be limited to Kenya. Its market should be Lagos, Johannesburg, Accra, Cairo. When capital flows freely across borders, when regulations harmonize, when infrastructure connects, our innovators can scale beyond villages, beyond cities, beyond nations. That is how unicorns are born. Not from isolated brilliance, but from connected ecosystems. Think of agriculture. Africa has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet we still import food. Why? Because we treat agriculture as national rather than continental. Collaboration would mean building Pan-African value chains, food grown in one region, processed in another, distributed across the continent. That is how you feed not just Africa but the world. Think of energy. The Sahara has enough sunlight to power all of Europe. The Congo River could power half the continent. But nations hoard resources, projects remain national, and opportunities get wasted. Collaboration could mean an Africa that lights itself and then exports energy to the world. But collaboration is not just about economics. It is about psychology. It is about identity. We must see ourselves first as Africans before we see ourselves as citizens of countries. We must believe that what happens in Senegal matters in South Africa, that what happens in Ethiopia matters in Ghana. Because until we see our fates as linked, we will remain weak. Divided, we are stories of struggle. Together, we are a narrative of strength. Yet here is the challenge: unity requires sacrifice. It requires us to let go of the small pride of nationalism for the greater pride of continental leadership. It requires us to stop thinking my country first and start thinking our continent forward. That is not easy, but nothing great is ever easy, and the future will not wait for us to figure it out. There are those who benefit from our division. They thrive when we compete against each other. They profit when we trade more with Europe than with each other, when we import what we could produce ourselves, when we fight wars that weaken us while they strengthen their grip. Breaking that cycle requires courage. It requires leaders willing to stand not for their borders but for their people. Collaboration also requires infrastructure. Roads that cross borders, railways that connect regions, digital highways that make information flow as easily in Bamako as in Cape Town. Without connectivity, collaboration remains an idea. With connectivity, it becomes unstoppable. And let us not underestimate the power of culture. Music has already done what politics has failed to do. Afrobeats is not Nigerian, it is African. Nollywood is not just Nigerian, it is African. These cultural movements prove something profound. When Africans create together, the world listens. That same spirit must drive our business, our politics, our technology. So here is the truth. The rise of Africa will not be built by isolated nations. It will be built by a united people. Collaboration is not a choice. It is the catalyst, it is the ignition, it is the multiplier that transforms potential into power. And when we collaborate, we will not only change Africa, we will change the world. A united Africa is not just a new player in the global economy. It is a superpower, and the world is not ready for it, but it is coming. The borders on that map are not destiny, they are distractions. The destiny of Africa is collaboration. And when collaboration becomes culture, when Pan-Africanism becomes practice, then the lion that has been caged will finally roar, not as many voices, but as one. Because together, Africa does not rise. Together, Africa soars. Stories are powerful. They shape nations, they define identities, they frame the way the world sees us, and more dangerously, the way we see ourselves. For too long, Africa's story has been told by others. Outsiders wrote the script, directed the narrative, and cast us in roles we never auditioned for. We were portrayed as the continent of famine, poverty, and dependence, a land forever emerging, never arrived. And because stories are not just reflections but instructions, too many of us began to live according to that script. Narrative is not entertainment. Narrative is power. Whoever tells the story owns the story. Whoever owns the story owns the future. And that is why narrative ownership is not optional. It is essential. Because if Africa continues to allow others to tell its story, Africa will continue to play a role in someone else's play rather than writing its own. Consider this. The global imagination of Africa is still too often shaped by the images of hungry children, dusty villages, and conflict zones. Yet the reality of Africa is a continent of megacities buzzing with energy, of skyscrapers climbing into the sky, of young entrepreneurs designing apps that solve global problems. The reality is a continent where music, fashion, and film are no longer local products, but global exports. The disconnect is not in what Africa is, but in what Africa is allowed to be seen as. And until we reclaim the narrative, that disconnect will continue. Think about the word aid. For decades, the global narrative has been that Africa is a recipient of aid, that without handouts from the West we cannot survive. But the truth is, Africa has given far more to the world than it has ever received. Our resources built global empires, our people built foreign economies, our culture continues to shape global creativity, yet in the story we are the needy ones. That is narrative theft, that is narrative manipulation. But here is the good news: narratives can be rewritten, stories can be reclaimed, and Africa is already doing it. Look at Afrobeats, once dismissed as local music. Now it dominates global charts. Nollywood, once ignored, now it is the second largest film industry in the world. African literature, fashion, cuisine, these are no longer regional curiosities. They are global conversations. That is what happens when we tell our story on our terms. The key is ownership, because without ownership, we are merely participants in someone else's version of events. Ownership means investing in our own media platforms, our own publishing houses, our own film studios, our own channels of communication. Ownership means controlling the images, the headlines, the narratives that leave this continent and enter the world. If we do not own the microphone, our voice will always be distorted. But ownership is not just institutional, it is personal. It is the responsibility of every African to challenge the false story when they hear it, to correct the misrepresentation when they see it, to carry themselves as ambassadors of the truth. Because every conversation we have, every story we share, every image we post either reinforces the old narrative or rewrites a new one. Let's also be clear, narrative ownership is not about propaganda. It is not about pretending there are no challenges. We do not need to hide our flaws. We need to contextualize them. Every nation has corruption, poverty, inequality. But only in Africa are these painted as the totality of identity. Owning the narrative means showing the full picture. The struggles, yes, but also the successes, the progress, the brilliance. When we take control of the story, we also control the psychology. Because stories don't just tell the world who we are. They tell us who we are. A generation that grows up hearing only of weakness begins to believe it. A generation that grows up hearing of strength, resilience, and creativity begins to embody it. That is why telling our own story is not just about how others see Africa. It is about how Africans see Africa. The world has benefited from telling our story for us. Now it is our turn. Imagine the future when an African child doesn't dream of being validated in London or New York, but in Lagos or Kigali. Imagine when the global press runs to Johannesburg, not just for news of crisis, but for news of innovation. Imagine when African universities, not just foreign ones, are recognized as the places producing the leaders of tomorrow. That is not just possible, that is inevitable when we own our story. And let's not underestimate the economic power of narrative. Tourism, trade, investment, all of it flows not just from data, but from perception. If the perception of Africa remains risky, unstable, and underdeveloped, then capital hesitates. If the perception shifts to dynamic, youthful, and innovative, then capital chases us. Narrative is not soft power. Narrative is hard economics, so the challenge is clear. Stop outsourcing the microphone. Stop outsourcing the pen. Stop outsourcing the camera. Because every time someone else tells our story, they are not just describing Africa. They are defining Africa. And definition is destiny. The time has come for us to stand on global stages and not just answer questions but ask them. To not just be the subject of documentaries but the producers of them. To not just be studied but to publish the studies. To not just be portrayed but to paint the portrait. Because Africa is not a charity case. Africa is not a problem to be solved. Africa is a solution provider, a creator, a force. And the world must hear that not from outsiders, but from us. So let us reclaim the narrative. Let us rewrite the story. Let us tell the world who we are, not who they think we are. Because when the story changes, the future changes. And Africa's future deserves a story told with truth, pride, and power. So here's the bottom line. Africa doesn't need your pity. It needs your partnership in equal measure, grounded in respect, recognition, and reciprocity. The re-rise isn't about what you can do for us. It's about the power we unleash when we rise together. From Cape Town to Cairo, Lagos to Kigali, Africa is re-rising. And Sweden, thank you for being part of our rebirth story. Let's keep rising.